Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashyrn Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I had only been working for the carpentry company for a short time when this happened. I was fresh out of high school, barely an adult, and completely new to construction work. Most days I felt lost trying to learn everything. The other guys on the crew moved fast, talked fast, and already knew exactly what they were doing while I spent most of my time trying not to mess things up. The company itself was small, only about 6 workers total, so everyone had to take on a lot of responsibility. Because we were understaffed most of the time, it wasn't unusual for someone to get sent alone to a job site to start prep work before the others arrived. That's exactly what happened that morning. I remember my boss calling me ridiculously early, before the sun had fully come up. His voice sounded rushed as he told me to head over to one of the houses we were renovating. He said he'd meet me there briefly to explain what needed to be done before leaving for another site. I got dressed half awake and drove there while the streets were still mostly empty. The entire morning had that strange, quiet feeling that only exists right before the world wakes up. No traffic, no people outside, just cold air and silence. When I arrived, my boss was already standing near the driveway, unloading some materials from his truck. The house looked ordinary enough from the outside, but inside it was halfway through renovation. Some rooms were finished, while others were stripped down completely to exposed framing and concrete. The basement was where we kept most of our tools and supplies. My boss quickly walked me through the tasks for the morning, mostly basic cleanup and prep work, since I was still the inexperienced new guy. I was supposed to clean mud buckets, organize some materials, and get things ready before the others arrived later. After explaining everything, he checked his phone, told me he had to head to another site, and drove off. Then, I was alone. The silence hit almost immediately after his truck disappeared down the road. Something about unfinished houses always feels unsettling when nobody else is around. Every little sound echoes differently. The empty rooms almost seem too quiet. Still, I tried ignoring the feeling. I didn't want to act paranoid over nothing. Since parts of the upstairs flooring had already been finished, workers were expected to take their shoes off before walking through certain areas. I left my boots near the entrance and headed toward the basement stairs in my socks. That's when I first heard it. Panting. At first it sounded distant and muffled, like a large dog breathing heavily somewhere deeper in the basement. I paused halfway down the stairs, trying to listen more carefully. My immediate thought was that the homeowners probably had a pet downstairs. That explanation made total sense to me. Maybe they locked it in another room while workers were around. So I shrugged it off and kept going. The basement itself was partly unfinished, and honestly pretty creepy even during daytime. There were exposed pipes running along the ceiling, bare concrete walls in some areas, and weak temporary lights hanging overhead that cast strange shadows everywhere. The room where we kept our equipment sat farther back near one of the unfinished sections. I walked in there and started cleaning out buckets used for drywall mud, trying to focus on work and ignore how eerie the house felt being completely alone. Then I heard the bark. The second it happened, every muscle in my body tightened. Because it wasn't a normal bark. It sounded wrong in a way I still can't fully explain. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like a person trying to imitate a dog. Not in a playful or funny way either. It sounded forced and unnatural, like a grown man trying very hard to make a convincing bark, but failing in a deeply unsettling way. At first, I actually relaxed a little because I assumed it had to be my boss messing with me. It honestly sounded like something he'd do just to scare the new guy. I figured maybe he forgot something, came back inside, and decided to prank me before leaving again. So I laughed nervously, dropped what I was doing, and walked toward the basement doorway. I called out my boss's name loudly. No response. The house stayed completely silent afterward. That silence felt different this time. Heavy, I stood there listening carefully for footsteps upstairs or movement somewhere in the house, but there was nothing. No laughter, no doors opening, no signs that anyone else was there. That uneasy feeling in my stomach immediately came back stronger than before. At that point, I decided I was just going to head upstairs and maybe wait outside until someone else arrived. I suddenly didn't like being alone in that basement anymore. But before I could leave the room, I heard the barking noise again. Closer, much closer, and somehow even more disturbing. It echoed through the basement in this horrible, unnatural way that instantly made my skin crawl. There was something human hidden inside the sound that my brain couldn't ignore. It didn't sound like an animal making noise. It sounded like something pretending to be one. Every hair on my arms stood up. I remember slowly turning toward the darker hallway, leading farther into the basement, while my heartbeat started pounding hard in my chest. The sound had come from one of the unfinished rooms farther back. For a few seconds, I just stood there frozen, trying to decide whether to leave immediately or check what was making the noise. Part of me still desperately wanted a rational explanation. Maybe it really was just a dog trapped somewhere. So, against every instinct telling me not to, I walked toward the sound. The farther I moved into the basement, the colder it felt. The lighting got worse too. Shadows stretched across the floor, and walls in strange, uneven shapes from the dim work lights hanging overhead. Then everything went quiet again. No panting, no barking, nothing. I reached the doorway of one of the unfinished rooms and looked inside. And that's when I saw it. There was a dog standing there in the middle of the room. At least, I think it was a dog. It was huge, much larger than I expected. The thing stood completely still, staring directly at me from across the room. Its fur looked rough and patchy under the weak lighting, but the moment my eyes locked onto it, overwhelming fear hit me instantly, because there was something horribly wrong with the way it looked, especially the eyes. I still can't explain them properly even now. They didn't look like normal dog eyes. There was something disturbingly aware behind them. Something almost human in the way it stared at me. Not intelligent in the normal sense animals can be intelligent, but conscious in a way that made my stomach twist immediately. The thing didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark again. It just stared at me silently. And the longer I looked at it, the worse the feeling became. Its face looked uncanny somehow, almost like features didn't fit together naturally. I remember having this horrifying thought slam into my mind, completely involuntarily. It looked like a grown man hiding inside a dog's skin. I know how insane that sounds, but that was genuinely the feeling it gave me. Like something pretending to be a dog without fully understanding how to look like one. The fear that hit me was immediate and physical. My eyes actually started watering from panic. Chills spread across my entire body so intensely it hurt. My blood felt ice cold. And the thing kept staring. Its eyes never left mine for even a second. I remember feeling completely frozen there, unable to look away while every survival instinct screamed at me to run. Then the dog tilted its head slightly. That tiny movement somehow made everything worse. Something about the motion looked too deliberate, too aware. That's when I finally snapped out of it. I turned and got out of there as fast as I possibly could. I don't even remember grabbing my shoes properly. I just ran upstairs, nearly slipping on the flooring while my heart pounded so hard it felt painful. I made it outside into the driveway and stood there gasping for air, trying to calm myself down. Part of me immediately tried rationalizing what happened. Maybe it was just a large dog and my nerves got the better of me. Maybe the creepy basement atmosphere combined with being alone made my imagination spiral. But deep down, I know the fear I felt wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from simply being startled by an animal. It felt primal, like every instinct inside me recognized something deeply wrong before my brain could fully understand it. I stayed outside until another coworker finally showed up later that morning. I never told anyone exactly what I saw because honestly, I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding insane. Even now, years later, I still think about that basement sometimes. And every single time I remember those eyes staring at me from the darkness, my blood still runs cold, exactly the same way it did that morning. I've shared this story a few times before, but it still stands out as one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. For years, my old house never felt normal. There was always this heavy feeling hanging in the air, like something was wrong even when everything looked completely ordinary. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just an old house making old house noise. But as time went on, the things happening around us became harder and harder to explain. One of the strangest parts was the sounds. Whenever my family and I would leave the house, I'd sometimes set up recordings just to see if I could capture anything unusual. More than once, when I played those recordings back, there were sounds that shouldn't have been there. The most disturbing were faint noises that sounded like someone playing a guitar somewhere inside the house. The problem was that nobody was home at the time. The recordings would pick up random sounds and strange disturbances that I couldn't explain. Every time it happened, it left me feeling uneasy. As the months passed, the activity seemed to get worse. The atmosphere in the house became increasingly uncomfortable. There were nights when nobody wanted to be alone in certain rooms. Even during the daytime, there were moments when the house felt unusually quiet, as if something was watching from a distance. It's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it yourself, but there was a constant sense that we weren't completely alone. Things eventually became so bad that our sleeping arrangements changed. Instead of sleeping in our own rooms, we started spending nights together in the living room because it felt safer. Looking back, that alone says a lot about how uncomfortable the situation had become. We were trying to avoid parts of the house that felt the most unsettling, especially at night. One particular night remains crystal clear in my memory. I woke up suddenly from a deep sleep. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me awake, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone knocking on a mirror, not tapping, not the creaking sound of an old house settling. It was a deliberate knock, as if someone was standing right there and trying to get my attention. My heart immediately started racing. I slowly lifted my head and listened. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I looked toward the hallway. What I saw froze me in place. Standing in the darkness was what appeared to be a black figure. It wasn't detailed enough for me to make out any facial features, but it was clearly darker than the surrounding darkness. It had a shape, a presence. It looked like a person standing there, completely still. I remember staring at it, trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I thought I was seeing. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the longer I looked, the more real it seemed. Fear hit me harder than anything I'd ever experienced before. I couldn't move for several moments. Every instinct was telling me to look away, but I couldn't. The hallway felt impossibly dark, and that figure seemed completely out of place, like it didn't belong in the world around it. Eventually, I pulled the blanket over myself and tried not to look in that direction anymore. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for sounds and waiting for the sun to come up. After that experience, my fear reached a level I'd never known before. Every little sound in the house made me tense up. Every shadow caught my attention. It felt like I was constantly waiting for something else to happen. Because of how frightened I had become, I started keeping a Bible near me whenever I slept. Specifically, I kept it right next to my head. Whether people believe in the supernatural or not, it brought me a sense of comfort. It felt like a source of protection during a time when I desperately needed something to hold on to. Every night before going to sleep, I would pray. I prayed for peace. I prayed for protection. Most of all, I prayed for whatever was happening in that house to stop. For a while, nothing. Then came the experience that completely shifted everything. One night, I found myself trapped in what I later realized was sleep paralysis. If you've ever experienced it, you know how terrifying it can be. Your mind wakes up, but your body refuses to move. You become aware of your surroundings while feeling completely helpless. I woke up and immediately realized something wasn't right. I couldn't move. No matter how hard I tried, my body wouldn't respond. Panic started building inside me. My breathing felt shallow, and all I could think about was every frightening thing that had happened in that house leading up to that moment. Then I noticed someone standing nearby. At first, I thought it was another terrifying experience like the one in the hallway. But this felt completely different. The figure wasn't dark. It wasn't threatening. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of calm. What I saw looked like Jesus. I know some people may be skeptical when they hear stories like this, and that's perfectly understandable. All I can do is describe exactly what I experienced. The figure looked at me and smiled. It wasn't a frightening smile. It wasn't strange or unsettling. It felt warm, reassuring, and peaceful in a way that's difficult to put into words. The fear I'd been carrying for months suddenly started fading. Then he spoke. The words were simple. Do not worry. The moment I heard those words, an incredible feeling of peace washed over me. The panic disappeared almost instantly. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel afraid. As I watched, he moved toward the bottom of the staircase. Everything around him felt calm and bright, even though the house itself remained unchanged. Then he stopped and turned. He opened his arms and spoke again. You do not belong here. The words echoed through me in a way I can't fully explain. It felt as though they weren't directed at me, but at whatever had been causing all the fear and disturbances in the house. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Even during the paralysis, I felt something change. The overwhelming heaviness that had lingered in the house for so long suddenly felt weaker. It was as if a pressure I'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been lifted. A short time later, the paralysis ended. I could move again. I sat up, breathing heavily, trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me wondered if it had all been a dream. Another part of me knew it felt more vivid than any dream I'd ever had. What happened afterward was what made the experience impossible for me to forget. From that point on, the strange activity rapidly declined. The unsettling sounds became less frequent. The overwhelming feeling of being watched disappeared. The fear that had dominated our daily lives slowly faded away. It wasn't gradual over several years. It happened surprisingly fast. Within a relatively short period, it felt like whatever had been troubling that house was simply gone. The difference was so noticeable that everyone in the home felt it. Rooms that once felt uncomfortable became normal again. Areas we avoided no longer seemed threatening. The house finally felt like a place where people could relax. For the first time in years, we started sleeping normally again. There were no more terrifying nights spent listening for strange noises. No more constant anxiety every time the sun went down. No more feeling like something unseen was lurking just beyond sight. The house felt peaceful, and it has remained that way ever since. Even now, years later, I still think about those experiences. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand them. Maybe there are explanations for some of the things that happened. Maybe there are explanations for all of them. I honestly don't know. What I do know is how real it felt while I was living through it. I remember the recordings that captured sounds nobody could explain. I remember waking up to knocking noises in the middle of the night. I remember staring into the hallway and seeing a dark figure standing there. Most of all, I remember the fear that seemed to follow us throughout that period of our lives. But I also remember the moment everything changed. I remember the feeling of peace during that sleep paralysis experience. I remember seeing the smiling figure that looked like Jesus. I remember hearing the words, "Do not worry." And I remember watching him stand at the bottom of the stairs, opening his arms and declaring, "You do not belong here." Whether someone sees it as a spiritual experience, a dream, or something else entirely is up to everyone. Will have their own interpretation. For me, though, it marked the end of one of the most frightening chapters of my life. Whatever was happening in that house seemed to leave after that night. And once it was gone, it never came back. My family has a tradition that we've followed for as long as I can remember. Every 2 years during our summer break, we travel to Mexico to visit relatives and spend time together. When I was around 10 years old, we made one of those trips, and what happened there is something I still think about years later. That summer, we stayed at my grandmother's house. It was a fairly large home, but it was very different from the houses I was used to. Most of the property didn't have a roof because my grandmother loved sunlight and fresh air. The bedrooms, kitchen, and a few other important areas were covered, but much of the house was open to the sky. During the day, sunlight filled every corner of the property, making it feel warm and welcome. At night, however, the open spaces felt completely different. I shared a room with my sisters. Our room was located near the front entrance of the house. In fact, if you walked out of the bedroom, turned right, and took only a few steps, you'd be standing in front of the front door. At the time, I never thought much about that. It was simply where we slept. One night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, and everyone around me was asleep. Then I heard it again, barking, a loud, aggressive bark that echoed through the quiet house. A second later, there was a bang. The sound was so loud that it made me jump. I sat up in bed and looked around the room. My sisters were still asleep. Nobody else seemed bothered by the noise. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I was hearing something from outside, and my tired brain was exaggerating it. Then another bark came, and another bang. This time there was no doubt. The noises were real. I waited for someone else to wake up, but nobody did. My entire family had always been made up of heavy sleepers. I was the opposite. The smallest sound could wake me up, especially when I was in an unfamiliar place. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I climbed out of bed and quietly stepped into the hallway. The moment I left the room, I realized exactly where the noises were coming from. The front door. Every bark and every bang seemed to be coming directly from the entrance. I slowly walked closer. Even though I was scared, I wanted to know what was making all that noise. I stopped a few feet away from the door and listened. The barking sounded angry and frantic. It wasn't the kind of barking a dog makes when it's excited or playing. It sounded almost desperate. Then another loud bang hit the door. The sound echoed through the house. I flinched and took a step back. There was a small window near the door, but it was too high for me to reach. Looking back, I wish I had grabbed a chair or found some way to see outside. Maybe I would have discovered what was making all the noise. At the time, though, I was too nervous. I stood there listening for several minutes. Bark, bang, The pattern continued over and over again. Eventually, I decided to wake my mom. I hurried back to the bedroom and gently shook her awake. She opened her eyes and asked what was wrong. I told her there was something outside making strange noise. She listened for a moment and then shrugged. "It's probably just a dog," she said. Then she rolled over and went back to sleep. A dog. Maybe the barking sounded like a dog, but the banging didn't. The bang sounded heavy and powerful, almost as if someone was striking the door with a metal object. Each impact seemed far too strong to be caused by an ordinary animal. Still, my mom didn't seem worried. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel more alone. I was the only person awake, the only person hearing everything, the only person who seemed concerned. After standing there for a while, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. Normally, it wouldn't have been a big deal, but that night every shadow seemed darker than usual. The bathroom was located across part of the property, away from my room. I reluctantly made my way there. The barking and banging continued behind me. When I finally reached the bathroom, I quickly went inside and shut the door. For the first time all night, I felt somewhat safe. The small room became my temporary hiding place. I stayed there much longer than necessary. A minute passed, then another, then another. I kept telling myself I'd leave in a few seconds, but every time I thought about stepping outside, fear stopped me. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay there forever. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to leave. The moment I reached for the door, a loud crash exploded from outside. Something had fallen. I nearly screamed. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. For several seconds, I froze completely. Then I slowly looked toward the small bathroom window. Unlike the window near the front door, this one was low enough for me to see through. Carefully, I peeked outside. Nothing. At first, I saw absolutely nothing unusual. Then I noticed a flower pot lying on its side. It had clearly fallen over. I stared at it in confusion. "That's weird," I whispered to myself. The pot hadn't been knocked over before. The strange part was that there shouldn't have been anyone nearby. My grandparents' room was located far from the bathroom. My sisters were asleep. My parents were asleep. Everyone was asleep. There was only one room close to the bathroom, but nobody used it anymore. The room had been abandoned years ago and was now filled with old boxes and storage items. There was nobody there who could have knocked over the pot. I tried to think logically. Maybe the wind had done it. Maybe an animal had brushed against it. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. But none of those explanations felt right at the time, especially with the barking and banging still happening. My grandparents had once owned a dog, but he had died years earlier from what they believed was a snake bite. I remembered hearing stories of he had been loyal and protective. Whenever I visited, I wished I could have met him, but he was long gone, and there were no other pets around the house, which only made the noises outside seem stranger. After a few more moments of staring through the window, I decided I had enough. I wasn't going to stay there any longer. The only thing I wanted was to get back to my room. I opened the bathroom door and ran. I sprinted as fast as my legs could carry me. The path back included a few small steps, and in my panic I nearly tripped. My feet slipped for a second, but somehow I managed to keep my balance. I didn't dare look behind me, not once. Every instinct told me to keep moving. As I ran, I thought I heard something behind me. Maybe footsteps, maybe movement, maybe nothing at all. Whatever it was, I refused to turn around. I reached my room and rushed inside. The moment I closed the door, the barking and banging returned. Loud, relentless, unexplained, lying in bed, my imagination ran wild. I wondered if someone was outside with a dog. Maybe someone wanted to get inside. Maybe a large animal was attacking the door. Maybe there was something else entirely. At 10 years old, every possibility seemed terrifying. I barely slept that. Whenever I started to drift off, another bark or another bang would pull me back awake. By morning, I was exhausted. I hoped it had been a one-time event. I hoped the following night would be normal. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The next night, the sounds returned. The barking started again, then the banging. Just like before. It was as if whatever had been outside had come back. This time, I was prepared. After searching through our room, I found a pair of headphones that belonged to my sister. I plugged them in and turned on music. The volume wasn't extremely loud, but it was enough to drown out most of the noises. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep listening to music and managed to get through the night. The next day, however, I became sick. I don't know whether it was related to stress, lack of sleep, or simple bad luck. All I know is that I felt terrible. My energy disappeared. Walking felt difficult. I spent most of the day resting. Eventually, I received a shot that helped me recover. A day or two later, I finally felt strong enough to move around normally again. Once I recovered, I started paying closer attention to the area outside the front door. Across from my grandmother's house were several other homes. There were also a number of stray and neighborhood dogs that wandered through the area regularly. Seeing them made me wonder if one of them had been responsible for the barking. For a while, that seemed like the most reasonable explanation. Then I noticed something that immediately changed my mind. The front door had scratches on it. Deep scratches, not small marks that could easily be ignored. These scratches were long and noticeable. They looked almost like claw marks. I stared at them for several moments. They didn't look like the kind of damage a small animal would leave behind. They were surprisingly large. As I examined the door more closely, I noticed something else. A dent. A clear dent in the metal. The sight instantly brought back memories of the loud bangs I had heard during those nights. Something had hit the door hard enough to leave a visible mark. I ran my fingers across the damaged area. The dent wasn't huge, but it was impossible to ignore. Immediately, the questions started racing through my mind. What had been outside? Was it a dog? If it was a dog, how had it managed to hit the door that hard? What caused the scratches? Why had the barking continued for so long? Most importantly, why did it happen in the middle of the night? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I never found any answers. Nobody in my family seemed particularly concerned. Nobody else had heard what I heard. Nobody else had stayed awake through those long nights, listening to the barking and banging. To everyone else, it was just another normal visit. To me, it became one of the strangest memories of my childhood. Even now, years later, I still remember standing in front of that damaged door. I remember looking at the scratches. I remember seeing the dent. I remember hearing those loud impacts echo through the house while everyone else slept peacefully. Whenever I think back to that trip, one question always comes to mind. Who or what was outside that door? To this day, I still don't know the answer. For the past few weeks, something strange has been happening around my house, and I still haven't been able to figure out what to make of it. It started with the sound of cats. Almost every night, I'd hear cats meowing somewhere outside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cats wandering through neighborhoods at night isn't exactly unusual. The strange part was that we don't own a cat, and never have. None of my immediate neighbors own one either, at least not that I know of. Yet the meowing kept happening. Sometimes it sounded distant, like it was coming from the other side of the street. Other times, it sounded much closer, almost as if the cat was sitting right outside one of the windows. The sounds were never consistent. Some nights, I'd hear a single meow before everything went quiet. Other nights, it would continue for several minutes at a time. The noises always seemed to happen when everything else was silent. making them stand out even more. Eventually, I got used to it, or at least I thought I did. Then one night, something happened that made those strange cat sounds seem insignificant in comparison. It was late, and I had been feeling too lazy to walk all the way to my bedroom. Instead of going upstairs, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I grabbed a blanket, got comfortable, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. The entire house was dark. For a few seconds, I lay there trying to figure out why I was suddenly awake. Then I heard it. Movement. At first, it was a soft sound somewhere inside the house. My sleepy mind immediately assumed someone else was awake. Maybe one of my family members had gotten up to get water. Maybe someone was heading to the bathroom. That explanation made sense, at least for a moment. As I listened more carefully, the sounds continued. Slow footsteps, shifting movement, the occasional creak of the floor. It sounded like someone was walking around. The problem was that everyone should have been asleep. I remained still on the couch and listened. The sounds didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to become more noticeable. Every few seconds, I would hear another movement, another creak, another sound coming from somewhere in the darkness. A cold feeling slowly settled into my stomach. I considered opening my eyes completely and looking around, but something stopped me. Fear, the kind of fear that doesn't always make sense but still feels impossible to ignore. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe one of my family members really was awake. Maybe I was still half asleep and imagining parts of it. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe the wind was causing something to move. But the sounds felt too deliberate, too purposed, too much like someone quietly moving from room to room. The longer I listened, the more nervous I became. I could feel my heartbeat getting faster. The living room suddenly felt much larger and much darker than it had before. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every corner felt impossible to see clearly. The noises continued. At one point, it sounded as though whatever was moving had come closer. Not close enough for me to hear breathing. Not close enough to touch me. But close enough that I became aware of just how vulnerable I felt, lying there on the couch. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to jump up and turn on a light. Another part of me wanted to stay perfectly still and pretend I was asleep. The second option won. I squeezed my eyes shut. I forced myself not to move. Not even I focused on breathing normally. I didn't want whoever or whatever might be there to know I was awake. Minutes seemed to crawl by. Every sound felt amplified by the silence around it. I listened carefully, waiting for the next footstep, waiting for the next creak, waiting for something to happen. Then suddenly, nothing. The sound stopped. Completely, the house fell silent, not instantly. One moment there was movement. The next moment there was absolutely nothing. The silence almost felt stranger than the noises themselves. I stayed frozen. I didn't dare open my eyes. I didn't dare move my head. I simply lay there listening. The silence continued. No footsteps, no creaks, no movement. Nothing, for some reason, that made me even more My mind immediately began imagining possibilities. Had whoever was moving left? Had they noticed I was awake? Were they standing somewhere nearby, completely still? I knew my imagination was probably making things worse, but I couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. The darkness around me felt heavier with every passing second. I wanted to look. I wanted to know whether anyone was actually there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Fear kept my eyes shut. Eventually, exhaustion started catching up to me again. I was still scared, but my body was tired. Very tired. I focused on my breathing. I kept telling myself everything was fine. I reminded myself that there was probably a normal explanation for what I had heard. Houses make noises. People wake up during the night. Minds play tricks when they're half asleep. Those thoughts helped calm me down just enough. Little by little, my fears started fading. The silence remained unbroken. Nothing else happened. No footsteps, no voices, no strange sounds, just complete stillness. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When morning arrived, everything seemed normal. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. Everyone in my family insisted they had slept through the entire night. Nobody had been walking around. Nobody had been awake. Nobody knew what I was talking about. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it left me with even more questions. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe I heard sounds from outside and confused them with noises inside the... Maybe I was caught between sleep and wakefulness and imagined part of it. Or maybe there really was someone moving around while everyone slept. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the experience felt incredibly real at the time. Even now, whenever I hear those cats meowing outside late at night, I find myself thinking about that evening. I remember waking up I remember hearing movement in the darkness. I remember lying perfectly still, too afraid to open my eyes. Most of all, I remember the moment everything suddenly stopped and the room became completely silent. To this day, I still wonder what caused those sounds. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and those distant cat meows drift through I can't help but think back to that strange experience and ask myself the same question. What was moving around the house while everyone was asleep? When I was 6 years old, something happened that I still remember to this day. It took place so long ago that some details have faded with time, but the fear I felt that night has never completely disappeared. At that age, I was just an ordinary kid. My biggest concerns were school, playing with friends, and getting home in time to watch my favorite show. I never spent much time thinking about ghosts, strange sightings, or anything supernatural. Those were the kinds of stories people told around campfires or during sleepovers to scare each other. Everything changed one night when I suddenly woke up. I remember opening my eyes and noticing how quiet the house was. The darkness seemed heavier than usual, and for some reason I felt wide awake almost instantly. Curious, I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 a.m. As a child, I didn't think much about the time. It simply felt strange to be awake in the middle of the night when everyone else in the house was sleeping. I sat up in bed and looked around my room. Everything seemed normal. The furniture was where it always was. The door was closed. The room was silent except for the occasional distant sound from outside. For some reason, I felt drawn toward the window. I climbed out of bed and slowly walked over to it. The street outside was mostly dark. A few lights from neighboring houses glowed faintly in the distance. Everything looked peaceful. Then I saw him. Standing outside was a man. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor or someone walking by late at night. But something immediately felt wrong. The man wasn't, he was simply standing there, looking in my direction. Then he started laughing. Even now, years later, I can still remember that laugh. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear when someone tells a joke or has fun with friends. It sounded strange and unsettling. The sound seemed completely out of place in the quiet darkness of the early morning. I froze. For several seconds, I just stared. My 6-year-old mind struggled to understand what I was looking at. Why was a man standing outside at 3:00 in the morning? Why was he laughing? And most importantly, why did it feel as though he was looking directly at me? Before I could react, something even stranger happened. The man disappeared. 1 second he was there. The next second he wasn't. There was no walking away, no turning around, No movement at all. He was simply gone. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Nothing. The area where he had been standing was completely empty. I stayed at the window for several moments, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, fear took over. I rushed back to bed, pulled the blanket over myself, and tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. Those thoughts helped me fall back asleep, but the experience stayed in my mind. The next morning, I got ready for school as usual. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Part of me thought people wouldn't believe me. Another part worried that talking about it would make it seem even more real. Throughout the morning, I kept replaying the image in my head. The laughter. The way he suddenly vanished. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself that it had been a dream. Then one of my classmates approached me. He looked nervous. After a few moments of hesitation, he asked if he could tell me something strange. I agreed. What he said next made my blood run cold. "Bro, I saw a man laughing outside at 3 a.m. For a second, I thought he was joking. I stared at him. Then, I asked him to repeat what he had just said. He described seeing a man during the night. A man who was laughing. A man he had seen around 3 in the morning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart started racing. I immediately told him about my own experience. His eyes widened. Neither of us knew what to say. The coincidence felt impossible. How could two children have seen something so similar on the same night? The rest of the school day felt different. I couldn't focus on lessons. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept returning to the same question. What exactly had we seen? As a child, my imagination started running wild. I wondered if the man had somehow been near my house. I wondered if he had been near my friend's house, too. I wondered whether there was some explanation we simply didn't understand. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. That night, I went to bed feeling nervous. Part of me wanted to stay awake. Part of me wanted to prove to myself that nothing unusual was happening. I kept checking the clock. Hour after hour passed. Eventually, it happened. The clock reached 3 a.m. My eyes immediately opened. The room was dark and silent, just like the night before. For several moments, I lay completely still. Then I slowly sat up. Despite my fear, I walked toward the same window. I looked outside. Nothing. The street was empty. No laughing man, no strange figure, no movement. Everything appeared completely normal. A sense of relief washed over me. Maybe it really had been a dream. Maybe my classmate had simply experienced something similar by coincidence. Maybe there was nothing to worry about after all. Feeling calmer, I returned to bed. Eventually, I fell asleep. What happened next was far more terrifying than anything I had experienced the night before. At some point during the night, I became aware of a figure. At first, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. Everything felt strange and unreal. Then I saw her. A woman dressed in white. She stood silently nearby. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even look away. Every muscle in my body felt frozen. The room suddenly seemed colder than before. The silence felt overwhelming. I wanted to scream for help. I wanted to run. I wanted to close my eyes. But I couldn't do any of those things. All I could do was stare. The woman remained completely still. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence, not because she was moving toward me, not because she was threatening me, but because she simply stood there, silent and motionless, as though she had appeared from nowhere. The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. Seconds felt like hours. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me something was wrong. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the experience ended. I don't remember exactly how. One moment I was staring at her. The next, everything was gone. Whether I fell asleep, woke up fully, or experienced some kind of vivid dream, I honestly don't know. What I do know is how real it felt. The memory stayed with me long after that night ended. For weeks I was afraid to look out the window after dark. I avoided thinking about the laughing man. I avoided thinking about the woman in white. Yet those images kept returning to my mind. As I grew older, I tried to find explanations. Maybe the man outside was real and simply walked away when I blinked. Maybe my classmate and I had both misinterpreted something we saw in the darkness. Maybe the woman in white was part of a dream or an episode of sleep paralysis. There are many possible explanations, but no matter how many years pass, the memory still feels vivid. I can still picture myself as a 6-year-old boy standing by that window at exactly 3:00 a.m. I can still remember hearing that strange laughter. I can still remember my shock when my classmate described seeing the same thing. And I can still remember the fear that filled me when I saw the silent woman dressed in white later that night. Whether it was a coincidence, a dream, or something I still can't explain, it remains one of the most unforgettable experiences of my childhood. Even today, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night and happen to glance at the clock, a small part of me remembers those events and wonders about the mysterious figure that seemed to vanish into the darkness and the silent woman in white who appeared when I least expected it. Some memories fade with time. That one never did. Back when I was in high school, I was part of the ROTC program. Most of my memories from those classes are pretty normal drills, lessons, physical training, and listening to our sergeant teach. Nothing particularly unusual ever happened, which is why one specific day has stayed in my mind for years. The classroom itself was fairly ordinary. Desks were arranged in rows, military posters hung on the walls, and there was always a structured atmosphere whenever class was in session. Our sergeant ran things with a firm but straightforward approach, and most students paid attention because nobody wanted to get called out in front of everyone. I usually sat near one side of the room. Right next to where I sat was a separate room that was used as a changing room. Students occasionally went in and out of it before activities, but during regular class periods, it was usually empty. One thing I remember clearly was the light inside that room. Most of the time it stayed on. Even when nobody was inside, the light was almost always illuminated. Because of that, I rarely paid much attention. It was simply part of the classroom environment that I saw every day. One afternoon, our sergeant was in the middle of teaching a lesson. The class was quiet, and everyone was focused on what he was saying. I was taking notes and only half paying attention to the room beside me. Then something caught my eye. The light in the changing room suddenly switched off. At first, I didn't think much of maybe someone had turned it off earlier. Maybe there was an electrical issue. Maybe I had simply never noticed when the light changed before. I glanced at the doorway for a second and then returned my attention to the lesson. Still, something about it felt strange. The room looked completely different now that it was dark. Instead of seeing a brightly lit space out of the corner of my eye, all I could see was darkness. For some reason, I kept finding myself looking back toward it. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the doorway. The lesson continued. My classmates seemed completely unaware of anything unusual. The only person paying attention to that room appeared to be me. As time passed, I started feeling increasingly uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why. Nothing had happened. The light had simply turned off. That was all. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I looked into the room again. This time I saw someone. At least, that's what I thought I saw. A figure was standing inside the darkness. For a moment I froze. I stared directly at it. The shape looked human. It appeared to have a face. But there was something wrong about it. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe exactly what made it seem so unnatural. It wasn't a person I recognized. It wasn't a classmate. It wasn't my sergeant. The face looked unfamiliar in a way that immediately triggered fear. The more I looked at it, the more unsettled I became. I remember trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was another student standing in the room. Maybe someone had entered without me noticing. Maybe the darkness was causing my eyes to misinterpret shadows. I desperately searched for a logical explanation. But the figure remained there, motionless, watching. At least that's how it felt. My heart immediately started racing. The classroom around me seemed to disappear. I couldn't focus on the lesson anymore. I couldn't focus on anything except the figure standing in that dark room. Every second that passed made me more nervous. My breathing became faster. My hands felt cold. The feeling of panic kept growing. Eventually, I couldn't hold it in any. Without thinking, I reacted. Right there in front of the entire class. I suddenly blurted out that there was someone in the changing room. The room immediately went silent. Every student turned to look at me. My sergeant stopped teaching and stared in my direction. The expression on his face was a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What the hell are you on?" he asked. I pointed toward the room. "There's someone in the changing room." The words came out much louder than I intended. At that point, I genuinely believed someone was standing there. I wasn't joking. I wasn't trying to get attention. I was scared. The entire class looked toward the doorway. Some students laughed. Others looked confused. A few seemed curious. My sergeant shook his head and walked toward the room. I remember watching him the entire time. Part of me expected him to open the door and immediately find whoever I had seen. Another part of me hoped he would. At least then I would know I wasn't imagining things. He stepped into the changing room. A few seconds passed. Then he looked around. More seconds passed. Finally, he walked back out. "There isn't anybody in there," he said. The room erupted with react. Some students laughed. Others made jokes. A few people gave me strange looks. Meanwhile, I sat there trying to process what had just happened, because I knew what I had seen, or at least I thought I did. I looked back toward the room. There was nothing there. No figure, no face, nothing at all. Just an empty, dark room. The rest of the class passed in a blur. I barely heard anything my sergeant said after that. My mind kept replaying the moment over and over again. The light turning off. The darkness. The figure. The face. The overwhelming feeling that someone was standing inside that room. Every time I thought about it, I became more confused. Had I imagined it? Had my eyes mistaken shadows for a person? Was there someone there who somehow left before my sergeant entered? None of the explanations fully satisfied me. What bothered me most was how real it had seemed. At the time, I wasn't half asleep. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't distracted by anything unusual. I was fully awake and sitting in class. Yet for several moments, I was absolutely convinced that somebody was standing in that room. After that day, the classroom never felt the same. Every time I entered, I found myself looking toward the changing room. I couldn't. Part of me expected to see the figure again. Another part of me hoped I never would. Nothing else unusual ever happened while I was there. The room remained empty. The lights behaved normally. Classes continued as usual. But the memory stuck with me. Eventually, I left the ROTC program altogether. There were various reasons behind that decision. But one thing was certain. I never returned to that classroom. Years have passed since then. I've had plenty of time to think about what happened. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Perhaps the combination of shadows, lighting, and my position in the classroom created an illusion. Maybe my brain briefly interpreted something ordinary as a person. Psychologists often talk about how the human mind naturally tries to recognize faces and human shape even when they aren't actually there. That could explain it. Or maybe it can't. The truth is, I still don't know. What I do know is how I felt in that moment. The fear was real. The panic was real. The certainty that someone was standing in that room was real. Even though my sergeant found nothing and nobody else saw what I saw, the experience has stayed with me all these years. To this day, whenever I think about that classroom, I remember the light suddenly switching off, the dark room beside my desk, and the strange figure staring back at me from the shadows. I never found out who or what I saw that day, and honestly, part of me isn't sure I want to know. This happened when I was around 8 years old, shortly after my family moved into a new house. Even though many years have passed since then, I can still remember that night surprisingly well. Looking back now, there may be a logical explanation for everything that happened, but at the time, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. Moving into a new house was exciting at first. Everything felt different from our old home. The rooms were unfamiliar, the hallways seemed larger, and every corner felt like a place that still needed to become part of our daily lives. My younger sister and I were especially excited because we were finally allowed to sleep in our own rooms. Our bedrooms were right next to each other. If either of us got scared during the night, all we had to do was walk a few steps down the hallway. That should have made me feel comfortable, but for some reason, I never felt completely at ease in my room. From the very beginning, there was something about it that felt strange. I can't really explain it. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing bad had ever happened there. Yet whenever I was alone in that room, I felt uncomfortable. It wasn't overwhelming fear. It was more like a constant feeling that something wasn't quite right. At first, I ignored it. I figured I was just adjusting to the new house. Most kids feel nervous when they move somewhere unfamiliar, so I assumed that was all it was. Life continued normally for a while. My sister and I would stay awake talking or playing before bed. We were young, so bedtime rules weren't always followed perfectly. On the night this happened, I remember staying awake later than usual. Eventually, we both went to our rooms around 10 o'clock. I climbed onto my mattress and tried to fall asleep. The problem was that sleep didn't come easily. I spent a long time lying there awake. The room was almost completely dark. Without my glasses, everything looked blurry anyway. During the day, that wasn't much of an issue, but at night, it made the darkness seem even deeper. Shapes became harder to recognize, and familiar objects looked different. I stared into the room waiting to get tired. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour, I don't really know. At some point, I started hearing something. My name. Someone was calling my name. At first, it sounded exactly like my parents. The voice seemed distant, but clear enough to understand. I heard my name again. Then again, and again. The calls seemed to come from different directions. Each time, I became more. I thought my parents needed me. Maybe something had happened. Maybe one of them wanted to ask me a question. I listened carefully, expecting to hear footsteps or another sound that would confirm they were awake. But nothing came, only my name, repeated over and over. Eventually, something about it began to feel wrong. The voice sounded familiar, yet somehow unnatural. The more I listened, the more I realized that nobody was actually calling me. The house was silent. My parents were asleep. Everyone was asleep. The voice wasn't real. At least, that's what I eventually convinced myself. The realization made me uneasy. I pulled the blanket closer and tried to relax. After a while, my eyelids started feeling heavy. I could feel myself drifting toward sleep. That was when I noticed something in the darkness. At first, it was only a shape, a dark figure standing somewhere in the room. I blinked several times. The figure remained. My heart started beating faster. I stared at it. trying to figure out what I was looking at. When I was younger, I had a habit of staring at things that scared. Instead of immediately looking away, I would keep watching until I could decide whether it was real or not. So that's exactly what I did. I stared. The figure stared back. At least it seemed that way. I couldn't make out details, but I felt as though something was watching me. The longer I looked, the more frightened I became. Then something happened that made the situation far worse. Another figure, then another, and another. Suddenly, it felt as though there wasn't just one presence in the room. There were several. They seemed to be standing around me, silently watching. Even now, I struggle to describe exactly what they looked like. Their forms weren't clear enough to identify. They were more like dark shapes, with enough detail to make me believe they were there. Every instinct told me to move, to run, to scream, to leave the room and wake my parents. But I couldn't. My body refused to respond. I tried to sit up. Nothing happened. I tried to move my arms. Nothing. My legs wouldn't move either. Panic flooded through me. I was lying flat on my back, completely frozen. At the time, I didn't fully understand what was happening. Now I know that I occasionally experience sleep paralysis, and many of the symptoms matched what people commonly describe. But when you're 8 years old, you don't think about medical explanations. You just know you're terrified. The figures remained where they were. Watching, waiting, silent, the room felt impossibly still. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my heartbeat. Everything else seemed distant. I wanted to call for help, but even speaking felt impossible. The fear grew stronger with every passing second. I kept trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I wasn't fully awake, but none of those thoughts helped much. The experience felt real, far too real. I remember trying to close my eyes. If I couldn't move, then maybe I could at least stop looking at them. I focused on keeping my eyes shut. I told myself that when I opened them again, everything would be gone. For what felt like forever, I stayed there frozen. Eventually, exhaustion and fear blended together. The details become fuzzy after that. I don't remember exactly when the figures disappeared. I don't remember exactly when I fell asleep. All I know is that eventually the night ended. The next morning, I woke up, feeling exhausted. At first, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Dreams can feel incredibly vivid, especially when you're a child. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare. Then my parents mentioned something strange. They told me I had been talking in my sleep. Apparently, throughout the night, they had heard me saying things. Phrases like, "Go away," "Mother, why are you calling me?" "Hello," and other similar things. The moment they told me that, chills ran down my spine. Those were the exact kinds of things I remembered thinking during the night. I remembered hearing my name. I remembered wondering why someone was calling me. I remembered wanting whatever was watching me to leave. Hearing that I had actually spoken those words while asleep made the entire experience feel even stranger. My parents didn't seem concerned. To them, it was normal. I've always talked in my sleep from time to time. Sometimes I move around. Sometimes I mumble random things. It's something I've done for as long as I can remember. But for me, it felt different. The memory of those dark figures was still fresh in my mind. For the rest of our time in that house, I remained uneasy whenever I was alone in my room. Nothing quite as dramatic happened again, but the uncomfortable feeling never completely disappeared. Every now and then, I would wake up during the night and remember what had happened. I would glance around the room, half expecting to see those shapes standing there again. Fortunately, I never did. As I got older, I learned more about sleep paralysis. I discovered that many people experience vivid hallucinations while they're unable to move. Some hear voices. Some see figures standing nearby. Some feel a presence watching them. Others report hearing their names being called. The more I learned, the more I realized that my experience matched many of those descriptions. That explanation makes the most sense to me now. It was probably a sleep paralysis episode combined with the stress of sleeping in a new environment. Still, understanding something doesn't always make it less frightening. Even today, when I think back to that night, I remember exactly how scared I felt. I remember hearing my name repeated over and over in the darkness. I remember the strange feeling that nobody was actually there. I remember seeing the figures appear one by one. Most of all, I remember being completely unable to move while they silently watched from the shadows. Whether it was sleep paralysis, a vivid dream, or simply my imagination reacting to an unfamiliar house, it remains one of the most unsettling memories of my childhood. And although I've experienced sleep paralysis a few times since then, none of those episodes have ever stayed with me the way that first night in the new house did. Even now, years later, I can still picture that dark room, the silence surrounding me, and the feeling of helplessness as I lay there staring into the shadows, waiting for morning to finally arrive. This happened back in 2008 during my freshman year of college in New Hampshire, and even after all these years, it's still one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. I've gone over it in my head countless times, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but no matter how many possibilities I consider, the memory remains just as bizarre as it was the day it happened. At the time, I was living in one of the freshman dormitories on campus. Like most college freshmen, my friends and I spent a lot of time hanging out in each other's rooms. We were away from home for the first time, trying to adjust to college life, making new friends, and enjoying the freedom that came with living on our own. One evening, 4 of us were gathered in my friend's dorm room. It wasn't anything special, just a typical college night. We were sitting around talking, joking, and wasting time the way college students often do. There was no discussion about ghosts, paranormal activity, or anything remotely unusual. It was just a normal night with friends. The room itself was fairly small, as most dorm rooms are. 2 beds, a couple of desks, some posters on the walls, and random belongings scattered around. There was a window along one side of the room, and above it ran a large hot water pipe near the ceiling. It wasn't something anyone paid much attention to. It was simply part of the building. One of the people with us that night was my friend Dana. At some point during our conversation, my phone suddenly started ringing. Back then, phones weren't nearly as advanced as they are today. Caller ID was still something people paid close attention to, so naturally I looked down to see who was calling. What I saw immediately caught my attention. The screen clearly said, "Dana calling." At first I didn't think much of it. Then reality caught up with me. Dana was sitting in the room with us, not across campus, not outside, not in another dorm. She was literally sitting only a few feet away. I remember looking at my phone and then looking directly at her. For a moment, I assumed she was playing some kind of prank. Maybe she had secretly dialed my number to make everyone laugh. But almost immediately I realized something didn't make sense. Dana wasn't holding her phone. In fact, her phone wasn't anywhere near her. I answered the call anyway. The room grew quiet as everyone waited to see what was happening. I pressed the phone to my ear. Nothing. No voice. No background noise. No static. No breathing. Absolutely nothing. It wasn't as if the connection was bad. It was complete silence. The kind of silence that instantly feels strange when you're expecting to hear someone on the other end. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen again. The call was still active. I listened one more time. Still nothing. By this point, everyone in the room was paying attention. The conversation we had been having completely stopped. All eyes were focused on me and my phone. Then Dana said something that made the entire situation even stranger. Looking confused, she said, "But my phone is in my purse over there." We all turned toward the window. Sitting on the windowsill was Dana's purse. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had gone near it. And according to Dana, her phone was inside. For a few moments, nobody moved. We just stared. The situation suddenly felt incredibly uncomfortable. Eventually, Dana walked over and opened her purse. Sure enough, her phone was exactly where she said it was. Inside the purse, right beneath the hot water pipe that ran near the ceiling. The sight immediately raised more questions than answers. How could her phone be calling me if it was sitting untouched inside her bag? Maybe she had accidentally called me somehow. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But when she checked her phone, things became even more confusing. As far as we could tell, there was no obvious indication that she had intentionally placed the call. Nobody could explain what had happened. We spent the next several minutes discussing it. Each of us came up with different theories. Maybe the phone had malfunctioned. Maybe there had been some strange network error. Maybe the call somehow triggered itself accidentally. Every explanation sounded possible. Yet none of them fully explained the situation. The most unsettling part wasn't even the call itself. It was the timing and the silence. The fact that the phone appeared to call me while sitting unattended inside a purse. The fact that there was nobody on the other end. The fact that all four of us witnessed it happen at the same time. Eventually, we laughed it off and continued with our evening. College life is busy, and weird things happen all the time. As strange as the experience was, it slowly became one of those stories we'd occasionally bring up when hanging out together. Months passed. The memory faded into the background. Then something happened that brought it all rushing back. Later that school year, someone told us a story about the dormitory. At first, I assumed it was just another campus rumor. Every college has stories. Old buildings tend to collect legends and ghost tales over the years. Most of them turn out to be exaggerated or completely untrue. But this particular story was different. According to what we learned, several years before we had moved into the dorm, a freshman student had taken his own life in that very room. The details immediately caught our attention. The student had reportedly died by hanging himself from a pipe located in the room, a pipe near the ceiling, the same area where Dana's purse had been sitting when the mysterious phone call occurred. When we first heard the story, nobody said much. We simply looked at each other. The memory of that strange call immediately returned. Suddenly, something that had once seemed like a funny college mystery felt far more unsettling. I remember feeling a chill run through me, not because I suddenly believed the call had been supernatural, but because of how strange the coincidence seemed. Out of every room in the dormitory, why had it happened there? Out of every possible place, why had Dana's phone been sitting directly beneath that pipe? Why had there been complete silence on the line? And why had all of us felt so uncomfortable during the experience, long before we knew anything about the room's history? Those questions lingered in my mind for a long time. Of course, there are plenty of rational explanations. Phones malfunction, technology glitches, networks make mistakes, calls can sometimes appear for reasons that are difficult to understand. Even today, strange electronic errors happen all the time. Logically, that's probably the answer. And yet, knowing the room's history afterward made it impossible not to wonder. The human mind naturally searches for connections. When something unusual happens and you later discover a tragic event connected to the same location, it's hard not to link the two together. Whether those connections are meaningful or simply coincidence is another question entirely. Over the years, I've shared this story with many people. Some immediately assume it was paranormal. Others insist it was nothing more than a technological glitch. Honestly, I can't say for certain which explanation is correct. What I do know is that 4 people witnessed the event. We all saw my phone display Dana's name. We all knew Dana was sitting right there. We all watched her retrieve her phone from her purse. And we all experienced the same confusion at exactly the same moment. The discovery about the room's history came later. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, learning what had happened in that room years earlier transformed a strange phone call into a memory none of us would ever forget. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, I can still picture that small dorm room, the hot water pipe running along the ceiling, Dana's purse sitting on the windowsill, and the look of complete confusion that spread across everyone's face when my phone lit up with the words, "Dana calling." To this day, I still don't know who or what was really on the other end of that call. A few years ago, when I was around 12 years old, I spent several days visiting my cousins in a small town a few hours away from where I lived. At the time, it felt like the perfect way to spend part of my summer. I always enjoyed hanging out with my cousins, and any chance to stay over at their house for a few days felt like a mini vacation. Their family didn't have much money, and they lived in an old neighborhood in a small town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Many of the buildings were worn down, some houses looked abandoned, and the streets were often quiet in a way that felt strange compared to where I lived. Even as a kid, I could tell the area had seen better days. Still, none of that mattered to me. I was 12 years old. I wasn't thinking about the condition of the town or the reputation of the neighborhood. I was just excited to spend time with family. For the first few days, everything was great. We spent our time doing all the things kids usually do during summer break. We swam whenever we had the chance, stayed outside until late in the evening, walked around the neighborhood, played games, drank way too much soda, and laughed about absolutely everything. The trip was exactly what I had hoped it would be. Nothing strange happened, nothing scary happened, nothing that gave me any reason to feel uncomfortable. In fact, if someone had told me at the beginning of the trip that I'd still be thinking about that visit years later, I probably would have laughed. The weird part didn't happen until the very last night. Since we were leaving early the next morning, everyone was told to go to bed earlier than usual. None of us were happy about it, but there wasn't much we could do. All of us boys were sleeping in the same room. As anyone who has ever been a 12-year-old kid knows, being told to sleep doesn't automatically mean you're going to sleep. Instead, we stayed awake talking. One conversation led to another, and eventually someone suggested telling ghost stories. At first, it seemed like a great idea. We started sharing every creepy story we'd ever heard. Urban legends, paranormal encounters, stories we'd found online, stories we'd heard from older relatives. The room slowly became quieter as each story got darker. At the beginning, everyone laughed. By the end, nobody was laughing anymore. Even though we tried acting tough, those stories got under our skin. Looking back, they probably weren't as terrifying as they felt at the time. But when you're 12 years old, sitting in a dark room late at night after hearing story after story about ghosts and spirits, your imagination starts doing most of the work. Eventually, one by one, everyone fell asleep. Soon enough, I was the only person awake. I remember staring at the ceiling while the room sat in complete silence. The more I tried to sleep, the more awake I felt. After a while, I became thirsty. I figured getting a glass of water might help me relax. So I quietly climbed out of bed and left the room. The layout of the house is important here. All of the adults slept downstairs. The kitchen and bathroom were upstairs near where we were sleeping. That meant I didn't have to pass any adults to get a drink. The entire upper floor was silent. The only sounds were the occasional creaks that old houses naturally make during the night. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Everything felt normal. The house was dark, except for a few dim lights. I drank the water and prepared to head back to bed. Then I realized I needed to use the bathroom. Since it was only a short walk away, I headed in that direction. That's when I saw it. A shadow, not just a random dark spot, not a trick of the corner of my eye. A shape, something that looked like a person moving past the hallway. I saw it clearly enough to notice movement. For a second, I stopped walking. My first thought was simple. One of the adults must be awake. Maybe one of my uncles had gotten up during the night. Maybe someone was heading downstairs. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. I didn't think much more about it and continued toward the bathroom. I went inside, shut the door, and did what I needed to do. The entire time, though, I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow. Something about it felt strange. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because the movement had seemed unusually. Maybe it was because I hadn't heard any footsteps. Or maybe it was simply because my imagination had already been fueled by hours of ghost stories. Either way, the feeling lingered. When I finished and prepared to leave the bathroom, something happened that instantly sent a wave of panic through my body. The lights went out. Completely. 1 second the bathroom was illuminated. The next second it was pitch black. I hadn't touched the switch. I hadn't bumped anything. The lights simply shut off. For a moment, I froze. My heart immediately started racing. I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the bulb had burned out. Maybe there was an electrical issue. Maybe the power had flickered. Then I looked toward the doorway, and I saw it again. The same shadow, moving, passing through the darkness. The sight lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Every bit of courage I had disappeared instantly. I didn't wait to investigate. I didn't try to figure out what I had seen. I ran. The moment I stepped out of that bathroom, I sprinted toward the bedroom as fast as I could. My feet pounded against the floor. I wasn't concerned about waking anyone. I wasn't concerned about looking silly. I just wanted to get back to the room where everyone else was sleeping. The moment I reached my bed, I dove under the blanket. I remember pulling the covers up and staring into the darkness. Every small noise suddenly sounded threatening. Every creak made me tense up. Sleep felt impossible. I kept replaying the events in my mind. The shadow, the bathroom, the lights going out, the shadow appearing again. The more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. Hours seemed to pass. Eventually, I glanced at the clock. It was around 4 in the morning. I was exhausted, yet somehow I still couldn't fall asleep. Every time I started to relax, I remembered that dark figure moving through the hallway. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off for a short time. When I woke up again, morning had arrived. Sunlight was coming through the windows. The fear I'd felt during the night seemed slightly less intense. Everything looked normal again. The house didn't seem threatening anymore. For a while, I considered keeping the experience to myself. But curiosity got the better of me. While everyone was getting ready to leave, I decided to tell my aunt what had happened. I explained everything. The shadow, the lights turning off, the fear, the strange feeling I had experienced. I expected her to laugh. I expected her to tell me it was just my imagination. Instead, she looked at me with a serious expression. Then she said something that immediately made my stomach drop. "It's back again." Those were her exact words. Nothing more, nothing less, just those 4. For a moment, I stood there confused. Back again? What did that mean? I immediately asked her. "What do you mean?" But instead of answering, she simply walked away. as if she had never said anything at all. I stood there staring after her. The brief conversation left me with far more questions than answers. What was back again? Had something happened in the house before? Was she joking? Was she serious? To this day, I still don't know. The strange thing was that my aunt wasn't someone who usually joked about things like that. She was a deeply religious Catholic, very serious about her faith. The look on her face when she answered me didn't seem playful. It seemed genuine. That reaction stayed with me for the rest of the morning. Soon, it was time to leave. Our bags were packed. Everyone said their goodbyes. We loaded everything into the car. As we prepared to drive away, I looked out the window one last time. That's when I noticed someone. Near a pile of old bricks not far from the house stood a man. At first glance, he appeared homeless. He looked thin. His hair was long and messy. His clothes appeared dirty and worn. He stood there silently, just watching. The sight only lasted a few seconds as the car started. Even now, I can't say whether he had anything to do with what happened the night before. Realistically, he probably didn't. He could have simply been another person living in the area. But at 12 years old, after everything that had happened, seeing him there felt unsettling, especially because of the stories people told about that town. There were always rumors floating around. Stories about strange groups, stories about devil worshippers, stories about unusual activity in abandoned parts of town. Most were probably nothing more than local legends. Small towns are full of stories like that. But when you're a scared 12-year-old trying to make sense of an unexplained experience, every rumor suddenly feels possible. As we drove away, I kept looking back through the rear window. The man eventually disappeared from sight. The house grew smaller and smaller until it was gone. And despite visiting many places afterward, I never returned there again. Years have passed since that trip. I've had plenty of time to think about what happened. Maybe the shadow was just another person moving through the house. Maybe the lights went out because of old wiring. Maybe my imagination amplified everything after hearing ghost stories all night. Those explanations make sense. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. But no matter how logical I try to be, there's one thing I can't forget. The look on my aunt's face when she said, "It's back again." She never explained what she meant. I never got the chance to ask again. And because of that, the mystery has stayed with me ever since. Whenever I think about that trip, I don't remember the swimming or the walks or the fun we had during the day. I remember the dark hallway. I remember the shadow. I remember the bathroom lights suddenly shutting off. And most of all, I remember my aunt's strange response the next morning. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe it was all imagination. Or maybe there was something happening in that old house that I never fully understood. Whatever the truth may be, it's a memory I'll never forget. And wherever you are now, Aunt Jess, I still wish I had asked more questions before I left. When I was 9 years old, my family went through one of the biggest changes of our lives. We moved to a completely different country and had to start over from scratch. It was exciting in some ways, but it was also stressful. Everything was unfamiliar: the language, the people, the neighborhoods, and even the homes we looked at. At the time, money was tight, and we couldn't afford to be picky about where we lived. Eventually, we found an apartment that fit our budget and moved in. It wasn't exactly our dream home. The apartment was old, worn out, and looked like it had seen decades of tenants come and go. Many of the walls were faded, some of the furniture looked ancient, and there were signs of age everywhere you looked. Still, it was a roof over our heads, and that was what mattered most. One thing that immediately stood out about the apartment was that the previous tenants had left a surprising amount of stuff behind. Most of it was random junk that nobody seemed interested in taking with them when they moved out. There were old boxes, tucked away in closets, forgotten items on shelves, and drawers filled with things that clearly hadn't been touched in years. For my siblings and me, this was fascinating. We were kids. Finding old, forgotten belongings felt like discovering buried treasure. A few days after moving in, my brothers, sisters, and I decided to explore the apartment more thoroughly. We started opening drawers and cabinets just to see what had been left behind. Most of the things we found weren't particularly interesting. Old candles, broken decorations, pieces of paper, random household items. The kind of things people forget about when they move. Then we found a drawer that immediately caught our attention. Inside was a collection of old plush toys. At first glance, they looked normal enough, but the longer we looked at them, the stranger they seemed. The toys were old and dirty, covered in dust and stains from years of neglect. Some were missing buttons, others had torn fabric, and a few looked as though they had been sitting untouched for decades. When our mother noticed what we were doing, she immediately told us not to touch them. Her reasoning was simple. We had no idea where those toys had been or what condition they were in. They could have been covered in dirt, mold, or anything else. Reluctantly, we obeyed. But before closing the drawer, I noticed something unusual among the pile of stuffed animals. One particular doll stood out from all the others. Even today, I can remember exactly what it looked like. It didn't resemble any toy I had ever seen before. The doll looked handmade, almost as if someone had stitched it together from scraps of fabric. One eye appeared to be made from a pin. The other eye was noticeably smaller and seemed to have a cross stitched into it. Its dress looked old and worn. The stitching was uneven. Its arms weren't even the same size. One arm seemed longer than the other. The entire thing looked strange. Not necessarily evil, not necessarily supernatural, just unsettling. The kind of object that immediately makes you uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. Naturally, being children, we reacted the way most kids would. We laughed. We joked about how ugly it looked. Someone compared it to a voodoo. Another sibling made fun of its uneven arms. For several minutes, we stood there creating silly stories about it and laughing. Eventually, though, we got bored and put it back in the drawer with the other plush toys. A few moments later, our mother called us to help with something else, and the strange doll was forgotten. The rest of the day passed normally. We explored the neighborhood, watched played games, talked about school. Nothing unusual happened. By bedtime, the creepy doll wasn't even on my mind anymore. That night, I fell asleep without thinking about it again. Sometime early the next morning, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The apartment was still quiet. Everyone else appeared to be asleep. I glanced at the clock. It was around 6 in the morning. The sun was beginning to rise, but most of the apartment remained dimly lit. Half asleep, I got out of bed and walked toward the bathroom. Afterward, I headed back toward my room. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stopped walking and stared. There, inside my parents' bedroom, sitting on a small table near the doorway, was the doll. The same doll. The one the one we had found among the old toys. The one nobody wanted to touch. For a moment, I simply stood there frozen. The table was positioned close enough to the doorway that I could clearly see the doll from the hallway. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't partially covered. It was sitting out in plain sight, almost as though someone had deliberately placed it there. A wave of confusion immediately hit. My first thought was that one of my siblings must have moved it. That explanation seemed obvious. But even then, something felt strange. Why would someone move it into my parents' room? Of all the places in the apartment, why there? And why place it so prominently on the table? I stared at it for several more seconds. The doll somehow looked even creepier than it had the day before. Maybe it was the early morning light. Maybe it was because I wasn't expecting to see it. Whatever the reason, I suddenly wanted it gone. I quickly walked into the room, picked it up, and returned it to the drawer where we had originally found it. Then I went back to my room. The entire time, questions raced through my mind. Who moved it? When? Why? I couldn't stop thinking. The moment everyone woke up and gathered for breakfast, I brought it up. I expected someone to immediately admit it had been a prank. Instead, everyone looked confused. I explained exactly what I had seen. The doll, the table, the parents' bedroom, the hallway, everything. Then I asked the obvious question. Who moved it? Nobody answered. Not because they were hiding something, because they genuinely seemed confused. My parents immediately denied touching it. In fact, they looked disgusted when I mentioned the doll. My mother reminded everyone that she hadn't wanted us touching the old toys in the first place. There was no chance she would have picked it up and placed it in her room. My father agreed. He said he hadn't even gone near the drawer. That left my younger siblings. At the time, they were only around 4 years old. Naturally, I suspected them next. Kids that age love moving things around. Maybe one of them had grabbed the doll while nobody was paying attention. So I asked them. Both denied it, over and over. They insisted they hadn't touched the doll. Normally, I would have assumed they were lying. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that explanation seemed. My mother stayed awake much later than everyone else most nights. If one of my siblings had gotten out of bed and wandered through the apartment carrying a creepy doll, she almost certainly would have noticed. Not only that, but I had woken up fairly early. There wasn't much opportunity for either of them to sneak into the hallway, retrieve the doll, carry it all the way to my parents' room, and place it on the table without being seen. The layout of the apartment made that difficult enough for an adult. For a 4-year-old child, it seemed even less likely. As the conversation continued, nobody could come up with a reasonable explanation. The mystery remained unsolved. Eventually, my parents decided enough was enough. Whether someone had moved it or not, nobody wanted the old toys in the apartment anymore. That same day, they gathered all of the abandoned plush toys and threw them away. The strange doll went with them. I remember feeling relieved. As silly as it sounds now, I genuinely didn't want that thing staying in the apartment. Something about it made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way it looked. Maybe it was finding it in a different room. Maybe it was simply my imagination. Either way, I was happy to see it gone. After that day, I never saw the doll again. Nothing else strange happened involving it. Life continued normally. We settled into the apartment, made friends, started school, and slowly forgot about most of the weird things left behind by previous tenants. But not the doll. That memory stayed with me. Even years later, I can still picture it clearly. The uneven eyes, the worn dress, the mismatched arms, the strange handmade appearance. Most of all, I remember waking up that morning and finding it sitting in my parents' room where nobody claimed to have put it. Looking back, there's probably a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe one of my siblings moved it and simply forgot. Maybe one of my parents absent-mindedly picked it up while cleaning and later didn't remember. Maybe I was tired and mistaken about where I had seen it. Those explanations make sense. But as a 9-year-old child standing alone in a quiet hallway at 6 in the morning, none of those explanations came to mind. All I knew was that a creepy doll we had left inside a drawer somehow ended up sitting on a table outside my parents' room. And to this day, nobody in my family has ever admitted to moving it. Whether it was a misunderstanding, a forgotten memory, or something else entirely, it's one of those childhood mysteries that never received an answer. And honestly, I'm perfectly fine with that. Some things are better left in the past, especially creepy old dolls. This happened a long time ago, and even though some of the details have become blurry over the years, it's still one of those memories that occasionally comes back to me when I'm alone. I've tried to forget about it, and I've tried to convince myself that maybe I was just a kid letting my imagination get the better of me. But whenever I think about that day, the same uneasy feeling returns. It started as a completely normal afternoon. I had spent most of the day at home doing homework and trying to finish everything before the evening. Like most kids, I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending my day studying, so when my parents suddenly announced that we were going to the park later, I became excited almost immediately. At the time, going to the park was one of my favorite things to do. It meant getting outside, playing on the swings, running around, and forgetting about school for a few hours. After finishing my work, we got ready and headed out. The weather was nice, and the park was fairly busy when we arrived. Families were scattered around the area, children were playing on the playground equipment, and parents sat on nearby benches, talking while keeping an eye on their kids. Everything seemed completely normal, at least at first. While walking toward the playground, I noticed a man standing off to one side. He immediately stood out from everyone else. He was tall and looked rough around the edges. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he appeared as though he hadn't taken care of himself in a long time. As a kid, I didn't think too much about it. My first assumption was that he might have been homeless, drunk, or simply someone passing through the area. Whatever the case, I wasn't interested in interacting with him. I barely paid attention and continued toward the playground. Soon I was on the swings, enjoying myself and forgetting about everything else. After a while, however, I happened to glance in the man's direction again. He was still there, and he appeared to be looking directly at me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People look around parks all the time. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. Maybe I was imagining it. So I ignored the feeling and kept swinging. A few minutes later, I looked again. He was still watching. This time, a small feeling of unease settled in my stomach. There was something about the way he stared that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't a casual glance. It felt intentional, like he was focused on me specifically. I tried to ignore it. After all, I was a kid, and I didn't want to overreact. But no matter how much I tried to focus on playing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, something happened that made me even more uncomfortable. The man started walking toward me. I immediately felt nervous. I wasn't used to strangers approaching me. As he got closer, I could see him more clearly. His clothes were worn and ripped in several places. His face looked tired. But what I remember most were his eyes. There was something unsettling about them. Even today, I struggle to explain exactly what I mean. They didn't glow. They weren't supernatural. There was simply something about the expression in them that immediately made me uneasy. The man stopped near the swing. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he asked me a question. "What is your name?" Looking back, I know I shouldn't have answered, but I was just a kid. At that age, I didn't fully understand why adults constantly warn children about strangers. So when he asked my name, I simply told him. The moment I answered, he looked at me strangely. Not angry, not happy, just strange. His expression made me feel nervous. I forced a small smile because I didn't know what else to do. Then I quickly climbed off the swing. Without saying another word, I walked away. I remember feeling relieved to put some distance between us. As I moved toward another part of the playground, I glanced back. The man was no longer focused on me. Instead, he appeared to be talking to other children. At first, I thought nothing of it, but something about the situation continued bothering me. A feeling deep down told me there was something wrong. I couldn't explain why. I just didn't like being around him. so I avoided him for the rest of the afternoon. Time passed. The park remained busy. Families came and went. Children laughed and played. Gradually, I stopped thinking about the man and focused on enjoying the rest of my day. Eventually, it was time for my family to leave. We gathered our things and started heading toward the exit. That's when I heard a woman shouting. At first, I didn't pay attention. Then I realized she wasn't calling to someone nearby. She was searching for someone. A child. The woman looked panicked. She was walking around quickly, calling out a boy's name over and over again. The fear in her voice immediately caught my attention. This wasn't a parent casually trying to get their child to come home. This was a parent who couldn't find their child. As she moved through the park, she stopped near me. Desperation was written all over her face. She asked if I had seen her son. Then she described him. As she spoke, my stomach dropped. The description sounded familiar, very familiar. It matched one of the children I had seen the strange man talking to earlier. Suddenly, every uneasy feeling I had experienced that day came rushing back. The staring, the questions, the way he had approached children, the uncomfortable feeling I couldn't explain. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I shook my head. No, I told her. I hadn't seen where the boy went. I hadn't been paying attention after walking away. But now I wished I had. The woman continued searching. Wanting to help, I joined her. We looked around the playground, near the swings, around the benches, behind equipment, everywhere, but there was no sign of the boy. The longer we searched, the more unsettling the situation became. The park suddenly felt different. The fun atmosphere had disappeared. Everyone seemed worried. Everyone seemed alert. People began looking around. Parents called out to their own children. The woman's panic became more obvious with every passing minute. Then, we found something. A small toy car. It was lying by itself on the ground. The woman immediately recognized it. It belonged to her son. I remember staring at it. The toy looked completely ordinary. Just a small car that any child might carry around. But seeing it there by itself felt wrong. It felt like a clue to something nobody understood. The woman picked it up and looked around desperately, but there was still no sign of the boy. At that point, my parents called me over. They didn't want me wandering around the park any longer. Reluctantly, I left. As we walked away, I kept looking back. The woman was still searching, still calling her son's name, still holding that toy car. The image stayed with me long after we left. For years, I wondered what happened afterward. Did they eventually find him? Had he simply wandered off somewhere in the park? Was there a perfectly ordinary explanation, or was something more troubling going on? The truth is, I don't know. I never found out. What I do know is that the strange man I saw that day left a lasting impression on me. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe my instincts were wrong. Maybe everything that happened afterward was unrelated. But even now, whenever I think back to that afternoon, I remember the uncomfortable feeling I had the moment he started staring at me. I remember the way he approached children. I remember the strange look in his eyes. And I remember the frightened mother searching desperately for her son while holding a small toy car that was all that remained of where he had last been seen. To this day, I still wonder what really happened at that park, and whether that uneasy feeling I had about the man was trying to tell me something all along. This isn't actually my story. It's a story that was told to me years ago by a man I met in a bar. We had been talking for a while about strange experiences and unexplained events when he mentioned that he knew a story that had haunted him for years. According to him, he had only shared it with a handful of people because, even after all that time, he still couldn't understand what had happened. Whether every detail was true or not, I can't say for certain. All I know is that the man telling it seemed completely serious, and the way he described the events made it sound less like a ghost story and more like an unsolved mystery. According to him, The story happened several years earlier, when a man named Brian purchased a house in the mountains. The property wasn't isolated in the middle of nowhere. Although it was surrounded by forests and mountain roads, there was an established neighborhood nearby. Other houses were scattered throughout the area, close enough that you could see signs of civilization, but far enough apart that each home still felt somewhat private. Brian had recently bought the house and was excited about the move. At the time, he was living with his wife and caring for his elderly father, who was seriously ill. His father's health had been declining for some time, and because of his condition, he relied on a wheelchair to get around. Walking long distances was impossible for him, and even moving around the house required assistance on some days. Despite the challenges, the family hoped the new home would provide a fresh start. Moving day arrived, and like most moves, it was exhausting. Boxes were stacked throughout the house, furniture needed to be assembled, rooms needed to be organized. Nothing was where it belonged yet. Brian spent most of the day carrying boxes, unpacking belongings, and trying to make the house feel like a home. Hours passed as he worked from room to room. By the afternoon, he was tired, but satisfied with the progress they had made. According to the story, he was in one of the bedrooms putting away the last few items when his wife entered the room. She smiled and told him lunch was ready. Relieved to finally take a break, Brian agreed and prepared to head downstairs. Before joining her, however, he decided to get his father. The old man had been resting in another room earlier, and Brian assumed he was still there. He walked to the room where he had last seen him. The room was empty. At first, he wasn't concerned. Perhaps his father had moved to another part of the house. Maybe he had gone into the living room. Maybe he was sitting near a window. There were plenty of simple explanations. Brian checked a few nearby rooms. Nothing. He called his father's name. No response. Still not alarmed, he continued. After all, there weren't many places his father could go. The house wasn't particularly large, and his father was confined to a wheelchair. Yet, as the minutes passed, a strange feeling began creeping into the back of his mind. Every room he checked was empty. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway, the spare bedroom. Nothing. His father was nowhere to be found. At this point, confusion began turning into concern. The situation simply didn't make sense. His father couldn't walk, he couldn't travel far on his own, and there was no way he could have disappeared without someone noticing. Brian and his wife searched the entire house again. Nothing. Then Brian considered the possibility that somehow his father had gone outside. The idea seemed unlikely, but it was the only possibility left. He stepped out of the house and began looking around the property. The afternoon was quiet. The neighborhood appeared normal. There was no sign of his father anywhere. He checked around the yard. He looked near the driveway. He called out repeatedly. No answer. As the search continued, his anxiety grew stronger. The situation had gone from strange to deeply unsettling. His father was elderly. He was sick. He relied on a wheelchair. How could he simply vanish? Determined to find some clue, Brian moved farther from the house. According to the story, he walked roughly 200 feet away from the property. That's when he saw something lying on the ground. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Then he got closer, and his stomach dropped. It was his father's wheelchair. The chair was overturned and lying on its side. Abandoned, empty, Brian rushed toward it. The wheelchair appeared damaged from the fall, but there was no sign of his father. No footprints, no obvious evidence of what had happened, no indication of where he had gone. Just an empty wheelchair sitting alone on the ground. The sight made no sense. If his father had somehow traveled that far, how had he ended up outside the chair? Where had he gone afterward? Why was the wheelchair abandoned? The questions came faster than the answers, and unfortunately, no answers ever arrived. The remainder of that day was spent searching. Brian, his wife, Neighbors, and eventually local authorities all looked for any sign of the missing man. The surrounding area was checked repeatedly. Roads were searched. Wooded sections of the mountain were explored. People asked questions. Everyone hoped the elderly man would be found nearby. But nothing turned up. Hours became a full day. A full day became several days. Eventually, Brian officially reported his father missing. One detail that always stood out to me when I heard the story was the delay in reporting it. According to the version I was told, nearly a full day passed before the missing persons report was filed. Whether that detail was completely accurate, I don't know. Perhaps there were circumstances the storyteller didn't know about. Perhaps the timeline became distorted over the years, but it was something that immediately struck me as unusual. Still, regardless of when the report was filed, the outcome remained the same. Search teams found nothing. No trail. No clues. No evidence explaining how an elderly man confined to a wheelchair could vanish from a residential neighborhood. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation gradually slowed. Theories emerged. Some believed the old man may have somehow wandered away and become lost. Others suspected foul play. A few people wondered if someone had targeted him. But every theory had problems. The biggest obstacle was the wheelchair itself. The chair's location suggested that something significant had happened there. Yet no one could determine exactly what. The years went by. The case remained unsolved, and according to the man who told me the story, no trace of Brian's father was ever discovered. No remains. No personal belongings, nothing. It was as though he had simply disappeared. As I sat in that bar listening to the story, I remember asking the obvious question. What do you think happened? The man stared into his drink for several seconds before answering. He admitted he had no idea. Part of him believed there had to be a rational explanation. People don't simply vanish. There had to be answers somewhere. But another part of him couldn't ignore how strange the entire situation was. An elderly man who couldn't travel far. A quiet mountain neighborhood. An overturned wheelchair found hundreds of feet from the house. And then nothing. No clues. No explanation. No resolution. The story ended there. The man finished his drink, shrugged, and said that was all he knew. I never saw him again after that night. Whether every detail of the story was true, exaggerated, or altered by time, I honestly can't say. What I do know is that the mystery stayed with me. Because unlike most scary stories that end with ghosts or monsters, this one ended with something far more unsettling. A question. What really happened to Brian Wells' father that day? Years later, there still wasn't an answer. And sometimes, the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones with terrifying endings. They're the ones that never got an ending at all.